Hello and good evening. My name is Sebastian Dubuskin, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Institute Materiality in Art and Culture at the Bern Academy of the Arts. This event is at the same time our Research Wednesday number 122, as it is part of Hannah Hölling's research project. Before I give the word to Hannah, I would like to thank her and her team for organizing this event, and special thanks goes, of course, to Claire Bishop. Finally, I would like to advertise for our next Research Wednesday, number 123, which will take place in 2 weeks on October 13th at 5 p.m. It will be held in German by Mona Konieczny on the topic of Klebstoffgitter für die restauratorische Verklebung von Leinwandgemälden, which translates to adhesive grids for bonding in the restoration of canvas paintings. For those who might be interested in this talk, I will copy the link for the details in the chat. Now, I wish you an exciting evening and hand over to Hannah.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Thank you for hosting us in the Forschungsmittwoch series. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next event in our research series concerned with the conservability of performance art. It's really a joy to see many of dear friends and colleagues amongst the audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Hannah Hölling, and I am greeting you in my capacity as project lead and research professor at Bern Academy of the Arts. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Claire Bishop, professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and an expert in all questions related to performance theory and history. Claire, I cannot tell how pleased we are to have you with us today. But before introducing our speaker with all attention she deserves, I'd like to welcome everyone also on behalf of my colleagues and co-members of our research team. Our artistic collaborator, performance artist and professor, Valerian Malba. Valerian, would you like to say this?
Hello, my name is Valerian Malba. I'm, as introduced, performance artist collaborating with Clara Schillig and head of the Master Program Performance Art at the Bern University of the Arts.
Thank you, Valerian. Our postdoctoral fellow, our colleague Julia Pelter-Feldman.
Hello.
And our the doctoral candidate on the project, Emily Magnon.
Hello.
Our research has been made possible due to a generous funding of the Swiss National Science Foundation and the continuing support of the Research Division and Department of Materiality in Art and Culture at Bern Academy of the Arts. As you know, this event is taking part within the series Forschungsmittwoch, as Sebastian mentioned, and is supported by the HKB Department of Materiality in Art and Culture. A few quick words about the project. Performance, conservation, materiality knowledge examines performance and performance-based works as a part of our culture, as forms changing and enduring in a network of people and things. In this project, we have switched the lens on performance from the established debates in performance studies, art history, heritage studies, and anthropology to the lens of conservation to consider and debate performance as a conservable form. We situate conservation as a disciplinary formation whose cultures, knowledge, and practices grant us an unprecedented access to the knowledge about, in, and of performance, its ontological and epistemic status, its temporal and spatial attributes, and its social, museological, and institutional embeddedness. We believe that these cultures, knowledge, and practices provide a valuable contribution to other humanities disciplines, expanding knowledge about performance, its making and remaking, its distribution and display, and its life and afterlife as an act, flesh, gesture, document, and residue. it has been in this context that we decided to convince Claire Bishop to join our conversation, to debate whether and perhaps to what extent performance art can be conserved, and what does it actually mean to conserve performance. And this is one of those occasions when one starts with the phrase, our speaker doesn't require an introduction, right? But let me say a few words nonetheless. Claire Bishop is one of the most prolific authors and critical thinkers in the discourses surrounding contemporary art. She holds a professorship in art history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and she earned her PhD from the University of Essex in 2002, and has published several influential books, such as Installation Art, A Critical History from 2005, Participation from 2006, Artificial Health, Participatory Art and the Politics of Spectatorship from 2012, Radical Museology, or What's Contemporary in Museums of Contemporary Art from 2013, and Claire Bishop in Conversation with En Conversación con Tania Bruguera from 2020. Bishop is also the author of important essays, including Antagonism and Relational Aesthetics from 2004, The Social Turn, Collaboration and its Discontents from 2006, and the article Black Box, White Cube and Gray Zone from 2018. Translated into 20 languages, her writing quickly became an indispensable resource for anyone interested in this subject, and were very influential for, I think, all of us in thinking about performance. So Claire, really, again, very, very warm welcome. And before we start, I shall mention that this event will have a conversational character, which will start with a discussion between Claire and the Performance Project team members. At around 16:45-50 Berlin time, say, we will open the floor to the questions from the audience, and we encourage everyone interested in participating to ask questions either via the Q&A or via our chat. We will monitor those questions and convey them to Claire. So please save your questions for the Q&A. The event will conclude at 18:30 and will be recorded and made available online. So now, Claire, my first question to you is, it's actually very titular, right? Can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why?
Okay, so well, thank you first of all for this invitation and for convincing me, because I think I took some convincing, because I really think conservation is not something I really think about, and so it's a way of approaching the stuff that I normally think about through a different angle or a different lens. So okay, so can performance be conserved? Let's start with the big question, right? And I immediately want to start dismantling the question because it's too big, and so conservation, of course, is something that I remember asking you, does conservation imply collection and acquisition? And you thought for a moment and said, yeah, I think maybe it does. But something I'd like to try and do today is maybe stretch conservation or to separate it from the idea of acquisition and collection. So that's the first one. And then performance, we think of, I noticed in your slide, you had performance and then you'd sneakily put in parentheses art, and performance art, which is not quite the same thing as performance as a general field. And so what I'd immediately like to do is break that down into at least 3 different areas, because we notice very different disciplinary traditions according to where people are trained. So for the most part of what I'm going to be talking about, and I think which is probably what you're thinking along the lines of as well, is visual art performance, as I call it, performance that's produced by people who have an art school background primarily. But there is also, of course, use of the art school background. People tend to circulate in museums and galleries and have some kind of relationship to the art market, although it might be a very tenuous one. And then there are the performers who are trained more in dance and have a more repertory structure to their productions. And they often depend on the funding structures of festivals and national and international funding, especially in Europe. And then, of course, there are the musicians who make their money in a different circuit again, often through recordings and through concerts and live appearances. And then there are the kind of the performers who are the kind of hybrid combination of all three. And I think of somewhere like University of Gießen churning out these kind of hybrid interdisciplinary performance groups like Gob Squad or Rimini Protocol. But they sort of veer more towards a theatre structure as well in terms of having a repertory. So I just want to flag that because I think each of those have a different relationship to repetition, to iterability, to virtuosity, all of which has a consequence for how they intersect with museums and galleries. And to date, I don't think there's been any real way to acquire or move dance into a collection other than as archive or documentation. So, but I'd love to know if there are examples, counterexamples of that. So it seems to me that the kind of visual art performance that does get collected is always the kind, invariably, maybe I should be a little bit more cautious. Okay, my hypothesis that it's always iterable, it's always score or instruction based. And that core of stability, and it could be a conceptual stability, but it could also involve naming who the different, the types of performers, what kind of training they need to go through, what kind of context is required. So any of these score or instruction-based performances with a strong conceptual foundation, I think are the ones most likely to enter a collection. And that could be stuff from the 60s through to stuff being made in the present decade. And so although this is a model that derives primarily from John Cage and the kind of the efflorescence of the Fluxus, Happenings and Judson that came out of his teaching, which was, as you can see, it already goes into music, dance and visual art performance. So the kind of distinctions I was making at the beginning are already there with Cage. It's that sort of score and instruction-based work tends to be associated more with visual art performance today than it is with music or dance. And so, a long while ago, I wrote an article about delegated performance, and I think that's the kind of performance which is often most likely to be acquired by a museum or to enter a collection. So this is where performance is outsourced to performers who make the work. The singular, charismatic, singular artist, the star figure, the Chris Burden, the Marina Abramovich, all the people we associate with those forms of body art from the 1970s, are cast aside, and those artists are now in the role of composer or of choreographer. They are the conceiver of the work, which is executed by other people. And in this essay on delegated performance, I drew out, which isn't particularly relevant for what we're talking about today, but it was that the type of performance is executed by people who usually represent a social group or category. And so they're invariably non-specialists. They're not people who are trained in dance or music or performance or theatre in any way. And because of this non-specialization, it enables the performer to be infinitely replaceable. Right? So this also is another thing that enables the iterability of this kind of performance, because you have an endlessly available workforce who are organized by rota to appear on certain days and to perform the work. And another characteristic of this kind of performance is it tends to operate on a different temporality. It tends to operate within exhibition time rather than event time, right? So it runs continuously through the opening hours of an exhibition, say from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Every day, rather than a performance with a given start and end point, like this event, or like a theatre production, or like most dance performances, which start at 7:30 in the evening, and you have a ticket and everybody assembles at the same time. So it seems to me, when I look around at the museums that are collecting performance, they tend to be the works that have this, this strong score or instruction-based component to them. Having done a little bit of thinking about this over the last week in preparation for this, I was also curious to find out that the criteria, or at least how Tate phrases their criteria, is slightly different. It's works that have both an object identity and a performed aspect. So for them, the score or the instruction is not part of the thinking. It was just something that I was bringing to when I look through their collection and see what counts as performance. So the things that are there have both an object identity that can be installed in the gallery in some capacity on its own, and then they can be activated, performed. There can be some live element introduced alongside that. And one example that Catherine Wood gave me yesterday is of Tarek Atoui's installation, a reverse collection, where for him, which is a collection of objects that are also musical instruments that he commissioned to be made from instrument makers by playing them a sound. And these were the sound of objects that were in the Dahlem collection in Berlin during the Berlin Biennial 5 or 6 years ago. And so the resulting objects, of course, look nothing like the original objects in the museum. But the important point I'm trying to get to is that for Atoui, the sound is primary, the object is secondary. And so this acquisition agreement that they've made reflects that hierarchy. So the museum is allowed to curate musicians to come and use those objects, but those objects are not treated with the care, let's say the care and attention that is normally bestowed on certain works of art, in that if the object gets broken in the process of being made, this is not an enormous problem. It can be fixed, it can be replaced. And so the usage of the object in the production of sound is what's the key aspect of performance. So then I think there's so those are the kind of, can visual art performance be collected? Yeah. Yes, absolutely, but it's certain types of things. Less easy to think of, I think, in terms of collection and conservation are those works that are more improvisational or process-based, or that hinge on this, the performance of the unique, charismatic, singular, virtuosic performer. It's like, to date, it has been impossible to collect a personality. And instead, that's when we find all of this sort of very unsatisfying acquisition of photographs, videos, films, and relics, and so on. And then dance is a different issue again. There's several modes of it. It's interesting how much Trisha Brown is being acquired by museums at the moment, and in different ways. Like MoMA focuses on the drawings. Tate has collected the sets to set and reset, and is working with and has the rights to restage that particular piece in collaboration with 2 dance companies in London, which is another sort of funny hybrid model. Merce Cunningham provides a different model again. You've got sets and costumes being collected by the Walker Art Gallery and Art Center in Minneapolis. But the dance itself is maintained by the Merce Cunningham Trust here in New York, where which has a very vigorous program of teaching, like constantly organizing classes and licensing, so that if students or other companies want to produce this work, they send along the team of experts who will train up the thing. And so I like to move towards thinking of that as a mode of conservation, in order to get us away from the acquisition and object-based way of thinking about conservation. But I don't know, you're probably already thinking about this already.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer, and I could follow up in so many different ways. I think also one of the issues that perhaps is becomes pertinent in this context is actually, what does it mean to conserve performance? Because you alluded to it, in very many different ways. But could I perhaps, yes, ask this question as a follow-up? What does it mean for you, from your particular perspective, from your observation, to conserve performance?
Well, if we're thinking of this sort of non-acquisitional mode, I think it would be about, what is needed in order to support the continuation of this practice. And for a living artist, that might be, well, there's the residency model, right? But that usually comes with the, with the golden handcuffs of, well, you have to produce a new work, and you have to premiere that new work at our institution. So residencies, I think, are sort of only go so far. And you know, they also come with maybe also the proviso that you have to make your rehearsals visible to an audience, which a lot of people are very uncomfortable with. But I think, you know, maybe it's, you know, it's about transmission, you know, conservation as support and conservation as transmission. You know, what enables this to continue being the best it can possibly be, even though the artist is no longer with us. So part of, and I'm sure you know this example of the Simone Forti acquisition at MoMA, which includes a large teaching component, working with Dance Space, having regular workshops. You know, that's also, you know, has some drawbacks to it, because once the museum institution is the body that authorizes the transmission, things that get encoded in certain ways that you gradually see the encroachment of the language of authority and authenticity, and you know, who's authorized to teach this. And so some of the kind of the sheer openness and generosity of those early Simone Forti dance constructions is, you know, I think is slowly being whittled away the longer that you have in place at the museum the person who is authorized to do the teaching, or who arranges the teaching.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because you know, this question relates also to a more kind of complicated one, and especially in the case of Simone Forti's, and I'm thinking here of, you know, the really interesting dissertation by one of our colleagues, Megan Metcalf, on Forti's, you know, collection of Forti's pieces at MoMA. So the question, you know, is here related to the idea, actually, what are we conserving if we think about Forti's work, or any other visual art performance or dance piece, although, as you rightly say, they are coming from very different traditions, and you know, and should be differently treated. But perhaps we can come back to this ideas a little bit later as our
or just while something's just on my head. I think there's something here about what's gained and what's lost by entering a museum collection. Yeah. And there are definitely gains in terms of accessibility and reaching an audience that is far wider than would ever reach it in the small circuits of downtown experimental dance performance. And I know that I've benefited from that institutionalization of Forti's dance constructions myself, because twice, like once at MoMA, and then once I then also hired the person at MoMA who's authorized to do this training, to do that with my students. And it is amazing to do the piece. I don't think I could have gone straight into doing the piece by reading the instructions, let's say. So it was really helpful to have somebody to talk me through a warm up, the best way in which to stand, and how to be with each other in order to physically be able to lift yourself up and get over. Because, you know, none of us were trained dancers, and we didn't have that leg and arm strength to be able to do that work. But what's amazing is that with half an hour's training, you can produce something that is an absolutely beautiful human sculpture that's constantly in movement for 30 minutes or so.
And it's also so fascinating because the sculpture actually has objectual kind of quality, and talked of, you know, in terms of more traditional, perhaps three-dimensional work. But very quickly, because I see Jules is commenting in our private conversations that some of our participants have problems with accessing the seminar. We have quite a lot of participants already, but if you do have troubles, I pasted in the Eventbrite the link to the seminar. So if you forward this, or we will forward the invitation manually also, the problem should be solved. Yes, but let's continue now, and I think I will just pass on to my colleagues.
I'm very happy that you mentioned the sound level. I mean, to mention the sound as an important part of memory altogether, including that, because this seems for me often a little bit underestimated. So we often have documents like written texts, scores, photos, videotapes, etc. But as the ear sense is kind of signature of a live performance. It's a real important part of documenting. And then the question is, how must the initial spatial and temporal context of a performance be taken into account? I mean, and if so, if we have to take into account how we should do that, but what are your ideas, please?
Well, you know, so much visual art performance today is made with a gallery or museum space in mind that I actually think that's less and less of an issue. And the kind of sound qualities that you're drawing attention to, kind of the peripheral qualities of noise and, you know, all of that might be distracting, or that might be a crowd or something that you're having to kind of shut out in order to listen to, or that is sort of you know, bleeding into the work in some way. I think that's also true of you know, a lot of the visual components of and spatial components of a dance as well. So in terms of, you know, so I really don't think the kind of initial spatial context is such a hurdle. Although of course, you know, things change drastically when moved from a small space into the kind of, you know, epic, unfriendly spaces of the turbine hall or Moma's atrium. I think the temporal context is harder to deal with, and especially and these comments now come out of my conversations with Tania Bruguera, the Cuban artist, who has a way of thinking about timing that she calls political timing and political timing specificity. And so works that might have struck a real nerve at a certain point of their creation, or hit some kind of cultural flashpoint, will now be missing. And often that's, you know, one of the laments about performance reenactment, is that it meant X or Y at the time, and now it's somewhat defanged or has been formalized, or it's just a sort of historical, you know, oddity of interest. But you know, we have to weigh that up against the reality that every iteration of every performance is going to be different, even if it's in the same space every night, right? There's always that, you know, that difference in repetition. I think it's the question of whether the kind of the relocation to a new space and time brings an appropriate or inappropriate set of references to bear on something. And sometimes these are completely out of control of the artist. And an example which immediately flashed into mind of Isabel Lewis's work, where she creates, and it's an interesting hybrid of installation art and performance and a sort of updating of relational aesthetics, where she occupies a space and it's very ambient. I think she doesn't call it a performance or an installation, but what does she call it? And it's not an event, she has a very particular, an occasion, right? It's called an occasion. So this is sort of special about it, but it's also kind of low key. And there's often sort of a lot of, you know, smells and plants and music and dancing, and she might talk for a bit, and it's very flowing. And her iteration of that at the Dia Center in New York was very beautiful. It was in a kind of space where the kind of whole side of the kind of front of the gallery space was lifted up. You could just flow into it off the streets of Chelsea. But that week was the week in 2016 where there'd been a series of murders of young Black men, and when there'd been the kind of the mass shooting in Texas, the kind of retaliation. And so the audience were just kind of went into that largely Black space, so traumatized by the news events of the last month. And this was not something that at all she could have predicted. The curators could never. So I just mentioned this to say that sometimes this is part of the, you know, a curatorial thinking about whether the meaning, the intrinsic meaning of the piece is shifting, and sometimes it's just context can just absolutely like screw with with our reception of something. I think there are moments where, you know, where we have to think carefully about what does it mean to restage a work, and does it need to be restaged? I remember having a conversation with a curator at the Walker Art Center, who then went on to other spaces, about he wanted to restage Graciela Carnevale's Locked Room piece, which I discuss in Artificial Hells, a piece where the gallery audience are invited. I mean, they're invited to an opening. She locks the door, and they're stuck inside the gallery space until one of them makes a gesture and breaks. There is absolutely no need to remake this piece. It signified precisely what it needed to at that moment of the dictatorship in Argentina in 1968. There is no need to restage this whatsoever. It's perfectly strong as a concept, as a historical event, as a series of photographs, as a poster. So not everything needs to be redone. Tanya is interesting in this regard because she specifies in her contracts that the work can only be restaged or reinstalled under certain political circumstances. And so, for example, the piece, actually is on the cover of Artificial Hells, Tatlin's Whisper 5, which is acquired, is in the Tate collection, and which comprises 2 mounted policemen exercising their crowd control techniques on the audience. And you're not quite sure what's happening, but you're kind of being herded around from space to space to space. So she specifies here that there's a clause in the contract saying that it can only be shown if there are certain social and political circumstances that will attune the audience to the right mindset for this. And she suggests, media coverage of protests or terrorism, for example. And so the work can be shown in places where abrupt social and political events have happened. I'm quoting the contract here, either in recent history, in the significant history of the place, at the moment when such events are an overwhelming presence in the media, or when the tension leading to the conditions for sudden civilian uprise are present. It's very, utopian, I would say. But, and I would also maybe want to distance myself from the idea of the audience having the right psychological mindset for a piece, because people come into works with a million different psychological mindsets, and the idea that there's an optimal one is a little too optimistic, I think. So I don't know if that's really answered your question. I think, for me, the spatial is much less tricky than the temporal context, if we understand time to be kind of a set of circumstances when a performance will resonate.
And what about the original performance? I mean, we spoke about the context, the temporal context, and the spatial context. How should they be involved in a process of conservation?
I'm not totally sure it can be, right? I mean, you can't include absolutely everything. It's a question of deciding what is primary in the work. And I'm sure that's something that you do all the time when making decisions about conservation, right? Like, what's the critical thing here? What's the core of it? Because for some pieces, the space might not be that important. At others, it's a response to that space. So it's absolutely intrinsic to the meaning of the work. But how can that sort of spatial sonic thing be recaptured? I'm not entirely sure that it can be, I mean, sound is one of those things that it's just very evanescent. It's like the energy of a crowd, an energy of an audience.
Right.
You look at a photo, you have no idea. This was something I encountered a lot when working with social practice and looking at participatory. I have no idea if this was a good project or a bad project, because I cannot tell. I cannot read these facial expressions and understand whether these people are gripped and excited or bored rigid. Just like that is, and that's why a lot of us like performance, for precisely those qualities that always exceed capture, and which you only get by being present somewhere. The energy. So maybe I would fold the sonic into that kind of audience energy.
That is a very important point. Thank you.
It's interesting to hear you use the word capture, and I wonder, so capture is, of course, something, it's a natural word. I think we all end up using it a lot when we have these conversations, but conservation is not just necessarily capturing something or fixing something. So I was going to ask this question in a very, very simply, but I'm going to make it a bit more, not complicated, but explicit. So we can think of conservation as a discipline that has a certain history, certain practices, methods, tools, but we can also think of it as, generally speaking, the perspective that artworks can and should survive, beyond today and be in some form accessible to audiences in the future. I'm not a conservator, I'm an art historian. I have no training in conservation. However, the conservation of performance demands approaches that aren't necessarily the ones that conservators have traditionally been trained to do, since the focus is no longer so much on the art object. So we might even be thinking about written texts or memories as possible forms of conservation. In a way, we could say that, that conservators no longer have a monopoly on conservation. So I find myself asking myself, and I would like to ask you, as an art historian, if the practice of art history might actually have a role to play in conserving performance, or to put it another way, if art history itself could be a form of conservation.
And my gut instinct is to say yes, simply. You know, I was thinking of a project that was done by Malba in Buenos Aires last year, which I was invited to be part of. And they attempted to do, given that it was COVID, pandemic, everything was shut down, how do you do a performance exhibition, but online? And so, and how do you do a historical performance exhibition? And so they really tried to sort of improve this missing history of Latin American performance. And it's very archival, but I'm also tempted to call it, you know, conserving it as well, because in that it allows these works to keep living in different ways. So each performance in the series, and maybe there were 6 or 7 in the exhibition series as a whole, and each of them one was released sort of week by week. So it had a sort of temporal structure rather than a dumping of lots of stuff online, which would have been overwhelming. And each performance was addressed in 4 ways, right? Action, witness, rumor, and archive. And so the first section, action, was sort of what is the work, you know, and often this was a video taken at the time. And then the second was the witness was a testimony by somebody who had seen the piece at the time of its making, at the time of its existence. And then the third one, which I was involved with, was rumor. So somebody who comes to the work much later and tries to make sense of it from everything. But I love the way that, you know, this is now, it's configured as rumor. Art history is now rumor because you're dealing with so much hearsay and you're trying to piece it together from all these other people who'd seen it, and you're trying to look at the images and you're trying to project yourself there. And so there was a lot of, I'd say, you know, I'm tempted to say critical fabulation, but that's Saidiya Hartman's term for something much more ambitious and you know, wide-ranging than I'm dealing with. So then you have rumor, and then the rumor person was a sort of a way of reframing it for a later generation. And then the fourth one, archive, was amazing, and I would love to see museums do more of this. So this included photographs, artist writings, the exhibition brochure or pamphlet where the performance was first shown, the press release, press cuttings, where it toured, you know, exact dates, pictures of it shown in different places, the different iterations, international press, how it's been exhibited subsequently, background materials that the artist was drawing on for the to make the work. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. It's what you dream of with, you know, like, I'm sure the artist has all this material tucked away somewhere, but it went beyond the artist's own archive because it was also, they contacted the other institutions which had shown the work and gathered together their archives as well. And so, you know, for example, there's one on Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Peña's 2 Amerindians piece from 1992 to 3, where they're in the couple in the cage work. And that's got wonderful, it's like got their archival materials that they gathered information about the human zoos, you know, about anthropological museums in the of indigenous peoples in the La Plata region, and it's, you know, and a bibliography. So it's in both art historical and a resource for art historians. And I was like, this is a great way of being able to know, understand, allow this piece to keep living as a cultural object for us through this acquisition of information. But, you know, where does that differ from, you know, the lines between that and archive and documentation are very blurred now. You know, they kind of tip into each other. But I guess, Julia, you know, I wanted to bring that up because it seemed to show a sort of, you know, a different and more maybe creative or inventive approaches to thinking about art history's intersection with conservation. But I recommend it. I can stick that. Can I type things in? I could also dump the website in at some point. But no, that's a waste of time. I'll do that afterwards.
Great. Thank you for these great examples, because I think it's kind of circling back to my next question. I was going back to conservation as it is practiced by conservators such as myself. And we do rely a lot on documentation. And in a way, I want to ask you, in your opinion, what is the relationship between performance and its documentation? And also as a follow-up, how can we distinguish the action of documenting, archiving, and conserving? Is there a difference, and why?
Yeah, I mean, they do seem to be, you know, archiving, documenting, conserving do seem to be separate strategies. But then the first part of your question was, what's the relationship of performance to documentation? I mean, it's a bit like, you know, it's these questions I find very hard to separate in my mind, because, okay, so the difference between performance and conservation maybe is then about the kind of the step of acquisition coming in, and documentation doesn't need to go through that particular hoop. Let me think. I mean, documentation seems, you know, today okay, so then we need to historicize, right? Because documentation has meant a lot of different things over the course of the century. From things that we just barely have any record of, like Russian futurist publicity strolls in the streets in 1913, through to something that has been Instagrammed to death in a contemporary museum today. So all of those things are somehow called documentation. And then the verbal is also a form of documentation. I don't know, I'm sorry, suddenly this one's rather broad, and I'm finding it hard to narrow that one down a little bit. Let me think. Did I write anything earlier when I had some thoughts going?
Sorry, I feel that I throw you under the bus. If
okay.
You want to focus on the second part.
I wonder if there's a distinction you'd agree with, that conservation is sort of like telling you how to, you know, it's about how to kind of maintain the physical or material or conceptual life of the work, but it also tells us how to repeat it in some way. And documentation and archiving doesn't necessarily have that step whereby we know how to remake the work as a result of it. I don't know, but that's maybe a question.
Can I maybe posit a possible distinction there? Yeah. Although our conservators will correct me if I'm wrong, because I would think that, so what you just said, that in distinction to a form of documentation or an archival process, conservation allows a work to be repeated. But I wonder if it is more that conservation tells us whether a work can be repeated.
Yeah, that's a good distinction.
Isn't what this repetition actually is, right? I mean, is it, you know, is it a reenactment, reperformance? Is it a remake, reconstitution? I'm just thinking about this article in Arts Forum, you know, the year in re, I think it was, published in 2010 or so, and in relation to the questions of conservation. So yes, I would totally agree with Joe's, just only expand on that a little.
Yeah. Yeah. Somehow I'm not so interested in questions of documentation. Is that bad? Should I be? I feel like it's something that comes up a lot in whenever I talk about performance, and it sort of always drags us back to the question of the commodity. And I really would love to liberate documentation from the commodity, and to think also about verbal forms of documentation.
Perhaps in conservation, we could also distinguish between a form of documentation that commodifies a performance and also the documentation that is produced in order to make possible future iteration and future repetition. And I think conservation of performance, as it is practiced now, is documenting works exactly in this purpose, in trying to find out how to perform it later. So in a sense, not the same form of documentation as it was practiced in the 60s, for example.
So what is an example of documentation that modifies the performance?
I wouldn't say that modifies, but that is made with the purpose of documenting how it is made and how it can be remade. Okay. Like asking the artist to produce, I don't know, training documents for future reperformers or things like that.
Is that not commodifying?
But it is
the performance?
Oh, I heard modifying, sorry.
Modifying.
But is that, it could, I'm not necessarily making this argument, but I could imagine that it could be argued that any form of documentation that allows a work to be collected by a museum is sort of supporting the work's commodification.
I mean, to be clear, this argument came up a lot when I was doing my research on social practice, where people had an extremely purist approach to we're doing something that is not institutionalized. And my question was always, but how can you convey these experiences to a secondary audience, to people who weren't there? And maybe that's photographs, although they're usually pretty bad for the most part. Photographs of social practice projects, or, you know, is there some form of narrative? Is it an artist talk? Is there a dialogue? Is there a publication? And if there's a publication, can it be as polyvocal as possible to reflect the number of people and voices that were part of that project? And whenever I brought up those things, it would sort of be thrown back to me, this line about, you know, commodifying it and turning it into an object. It's like, no, I'm interested in historical transmission, right? And it's not about, you know, the object is not the kind of core concern here. It's like, how do I understand it? How can I experience this at a later moment?
But there is also something really interesting. First, perhaps I should mention in the chat, Sandra Bradwich writes, clarifies some issues about documentation, that documenting means to kind of create a document, how the work is made, and so on. Archiving is something else, structure of storing the remains, and so on. But I think, you know, documentation can be so many things, as you mentioned, Claire. I mean, even a gesture might document a performance that was formally enacted. And I think, you know, on the experimental side of conservation, and in the future, we might want to consider these ways, how performance might live on in alternative formats, no? Yeah. How this gesture of conservation actually might embody a different form of, you know, continuing. Perhaps we can perform, you know, a performance that happened in the past without having this sort of ambitions of sticking to the original or to the artist as this kind of, you know, within this authorial model of singular authorship and so on. Yeah.
You know, I scribbled something down earlier while one of you were talking, which was, you know, live art needs live conservation. And I wondered whether that was something that could be, you know, which would then include, you know, kind of modes of education and training, but also, you know, verbal, enacted transmission. I mean, something I've always loved with talking with friends about a performance and they're describing it to me or I'm describing it to them is the number of times I have to get out of my chair in order to tell them about it. And it's not that I'm reenacting it, but I need to use my body in some way to tell them what was going on.
Yeah.
What is also an interesting aspect, I think, is in the performance art, there's no other field as far as I know. The performance art itself deals and works a lot with documenting in the performance itself. So often it happens that material is a documentation material from other performances or from colleagues and is part of a performance itself. The conservation and documenting the performance. So it's best practice by artists to deal, as performance art is ephemeral. So I have never seen this in, okay, we know painters who paint painters, but this is more rarely. But it's really interesting. So for example, Esther Ferrer is often citing or mentioning works of other artists, and are really embedding it in her own work. And so this is kind of best practice of performance artists conserving performance art and retelling and recreating. So, but what interests me is, when does performance art really becomes a transformation? So when does performance art become something else? So we are in this field of an ephemeral artwork, and as I mentioned, it's best practice to include documentation. But when does the performance art transform to in a state or where you have this distance? Near and distance is a big question in the context of documenting and conserving performance art.
I'm not totally sure I get the question, because something else is a little, it's generous, but it's also very open, and I'm not quite sure. I feel like you've got something in mind, but I don't know quite what that something else denotes.
Is it a question, Valerian, about authenticity and originality that we were planning to post anyway? Could we return to this question of identity later? I think what Valerian is asking is, this idea whether when we think about conservation of performance, whether we have to stick to some kind of identity conditions for the work, whether we might think about the work in a more expanded way, say when there is a performance, some kind of initial, perhaps condition of performance or initial stage, initial staging of performance, whether anything that happens later needs to be within the limits of this identity that was kind of perhaps set by it. And I don't know if you would like to answer it now, or perhaps.
No, I've got a quick response to that, which is maybe about, I'm very much into works of art that have multiple ontologies, right? That are not exclusively something. A classic example would be Spiral Jetty. It's an earthwork, it's a film, and it's an essay simultaneously, and you can't really take any one of those three things apart. It is that the work has those it exists in those three different ways, and I think there are numerous works that have been able to, and I love it when artists think about something across those different modes, because I think it's anticipatory of the different lives of an object or of a project. Like Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave was something that I've written about, that also has that multiple identity. It's a performance, it's an archive, and it's a film. And it's a film made by someone else that he's delegated that documentation to. I can't remember his name, the director who did his own thing with it, embedded it within a documentary about the miners' strike. So the more, I do like that multi-layered approach to making, to performance or to works of art in general, where it can coexist across several things simultaneously. But I don't know, is that quite what you were thinking of, Valerian? Maybe not.
Well, now I'm a bit overwhelmed with this multiple anthropology. For me, the interest is when does the status change? When does it happen that a performance is not anymore a performance?
Okay.
And in which hand it is delegated.
But maybe what I'm saying is that it can be multiple things simultaneously.
Yeah.
Rather than seeing it as something linear.
Yeah, right. Mm.
That's fascinating. Perhaps you could also come back to this, Valerian, thank you so much for asking, but could I pose the question actually in a different way, perhaps, about this kind of identity, perhaps formation in performance? I am very interested in the issues of intentionality, and we all are in the project, intentionality, originality, and authenticity. And as you may well know, in the conservation of, generally in the conservation of traditional works, but also in performance, and those debates are quite present. And I know that, it's not only a debate known in the conservation in a way, art history too yearns for authenticity. No, so I wonder perhaps whether we could start talking a little bit about this on an example, if you wish. How far the authenticity, the notions of authenticity, originality, and intention are actually somehow helpful in thinking about the continuing life of performance.
Yeah, it's so hard, isn't it? Whether you're dealing with the dead artist or the living artist. Right? So the dead artist, then it's a whole sort of field of projection that you're trying to sort of match up with what they might have said about it or what the estate is saying about it. And then with the living artist, it's sort of even more complicated because they can change their mind, they can be forgetful, they've totally forgotten what the work was about, they took too many drugs, they traveled a lot, it's like or they disown the work, they accessioned it from their list. So those things are really problematic, and I don't really, like you, I've got a yearning to get away from the intentionalist set of arguments, and yet it's so hard as an art historian to drag yourself away from that, because we do feel that there is a subject with agency and a position and a set of ideas who has consciously assembled something in a way that has led to this work of art, whether it's an object or a performance, and we don't really want to let go of that. I did notice, Hannah, I'm going to actually throw this back to you because I was reading your executive summary of the conference last night, and there was one line in it that was about intentionality, and I thought, oh my God, I have no idea what this means, and I'm so interested. And when you talk about intent, rather than inherently present, is always induced, a result of what Charles Sanders Peirce called a retroduction. Like, okay, I have no idea what this might mean. Please tell me, what is a retroduction?
Oh my God, yes, I was actually, it was very interesting because, well, first of all, this is a draft paper. No, I have to.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry to have pulled that out, but it just seemed like I'm an opportunist because I'm really curious.
It is actually an interesting concept, which I have to also elaborate on more. The version that I sent you was really a write-up from our colloquium before. Actually, also one of my colleagues, Jules, commented on it as well. So I was really pleased, to be remembered that notions like this have to be explained every time. But I think, the idea of intention came also up in the course of our colloquium in terms of the oral histories or the artist interview. That is a very powerful tool in the conservation of contemporary art, especially because so many of those artists are still around and living and intending. Right. So is it enough to actually speak about an artist's intention as a determinant force in the conservation of, a complex piece of installation art, which you are expert in as well, or in the conservation of performance, where there are so many different other agencies, actancies, and networks, collaborative networks that are engaged in the identity formation of that piece in question. No? So how can we actually still subscribe to this intentionalist model, and this intentionalist model actually in relation to singular authorship, to this, artistic hand that created the work as an original, unique sort of example of, visual arts. And this is, so I'm not saying that, artist interviews should not be made. Absolutely not. I'm absolutely fan of this model, and we learn so much from the artists, absolutely. But how it is being handled then in the conservation narrative is something determinant about the artist's work. I think this needs revision. Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's a conundrum, and I have to say I'm not instinctively sympathetic towards active network theory and other forms of, dispersed authorship. But then I don't know what the alternative is. I'm very open to other forms of projection onto it. I remember this, but I remember the first time I became aware of this as a problem was at a conference at Tate Modern, and it might have been Pip Lawrenson speaking, when they were talking about Hans Hacker's condensation cube, and how mold was building up in the condensation cube, and how he was very insistent that he didn't want it cleaned, and wanted that. But they're like, but this green fungus inside the that's not how it looked in 1965 when you made it. And I was completely, with the conservators there, are like, screw the artist intentionality. You've got to clean this box. It looks horrible. And so I'm sure this is something you come across the entire time. Where's the line that you draw between the artist's desires and your sense of fidelity to a concept?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's about some kind of conceptual fidelity. Maybe that gets us around intentionality.
Well, then there's also which version of the artist, because of course the Hans Hacker of today is not at all the Hans Hacker who made condensation cube in the 60s. And we could argue, I think, that this is maybe even more the case with performance, where the artist's own body is involved, and it's a completely different body that's talking to us today about what we should do with the work. So even if you wish to honor the intent of the person who created that work, that person in a way is gone. And we can sort of, we can have productive conversations with the person who's replaced them, but it's not the same as really knowing what that person's intentions were in a way.
But I don't know, the way you're framing that assumes that there are real, conscious intentions that can be grasped even at the moment when something is made. And I'm not so sure that's even, artists are trained on the whole to be pretty confident about how they speak. And, I always go back to Howard Singerman's great book, Art Subjects, about the training of MFA students in post-war America, and how speech and discourse become the central components of a post-war education. Right? Knowing how to situate yourself within a discourse and how to speak about your work, how to navigate the crit, how to do an artist talk. These are the things that are now taught more than technical skills or familiarity with the body of historical knowledge, or any of the other things that one might have got from art school education from the prior to the post-war period. And so there's a certain exercise of confidence that is produced through an art school education where people look like they know what they're thinking. But I'm also, my PhD training involved a lot of reading of psychoanalysis, and I'm not so sure people do really know what a work's doing at the end of the day. And I think there's a lot of stuff that is simply inaccessible in an artist's thinking about their work, and which is made up or invented on the spot, and which changes even from month to month how an artist will discuss something made even relatively recently. So for me there's a huge instability of authorial intention even with the most contemporary art. And so that's why I can't, maybe this phrase, conceptual fidelity, it's like maybe to try and get away from the artist in that, just to say, this work seems to be about this particular thing. Let's go back to Hacker. It seems to be about, a system, an environmental system, a responsiveness of materials to the atmosphere. You can start to talk about what the core of the piece is, seems to be about. And of course, that's going to be different for different people, but maybe some kind of consensus can be arrived at without necessarily leaning too heavily on the artist's intention. I don't know. Maybe I'm just making all this up as I go along. I'm definitely making it up as I go along.
This is very, very interesting. Perhaps we should also give a chance our audiences to ask or to comment, because I'm seeing there is so much going on in the Q&A. For instance, something related perhaps, but we'll also come back to the others, comes from a reflection by Paul Cuillard, he says, conservation seems to suggest that there is a finite thing that already exists that needs to be protected against loss, rather than something that can continually review and evolve. That is why I find those conversations interesting, because they change that view of conservation. This is, I think, yeah, quite interesting, a comment. I don't know, Claire, would you like to respond to it? Or should we just leave it?
Yeah. It's funny that you like the, okay. The question, there's something about conservation suggests there's a finite thing that already exists that needs to be protected against loss. But I think that protection against loss is itself active, right? If we think of restoring a painting, right, that's active. It's keeping it in some kind of, you know, keep it looking good, to keep it intact. That's an active process rather than something that is that's holding it back, you know, and embraces entropy. So it's not quite keeping something the same, it's keeping something looking optimal, which requires an active intervention. And so is that so different to the idea of collecting performances in terms of enabling it to continue to live, to be optimal, to I don't know, I'm making it up as I go along. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to stop because I'm just rabbiting. I don't know how to answer that.
It's interesting because it also brings us back to this question about identity, you know, how much changeability might we allow in performance, which we perhaps do not allow in the conservation of traditional objects. You know, a Mona Lisa should not change its colors, and probably in, you know, in course of the conservation process, but a performance art might perhaps, you know, kind of transgress the limits of acceptable change, you know, in order to live. But there is something else really interesting from Jan Wallace. He says, doesn't the conservation of performance art raise questions that are also relevant to objects that have traditionally been considered as primarily material? Thinking of religious objects, objects looted from colonial context that reflect their own distinct epistemologies, and or even contemporary artworks in traditional media.
Yeah, hi Ian. Yeah, you know, I was thinking all the way, you know, thinking last night, is conservation inherently opposed to restitution? You know, are these oppositional forces that simply have no common territory? Because conservation is holding on to something, it is tied up with acquisition, and restitution means, you know, letting something go into whatever context without any, I think good restitution means putting no requirements on the kind of environment that the looted artifact is going back into, right? You do not need to insist upon the climate controlled white cube space as the ideal destination for this particular object, because in many cases it was a living artifact. How to tie these things together? Ian, you've thrown a lot into one question there, and I, you know, all the way through, I just want to hear what you say about it, because I know you've thought about this. But you know, I'm struggling because I've got in my mind the kind of conservation as I understand it, and then conservation as I'm maybe trying to propose here as something live, as something fluid, as something about enabling transmission. And so, sure, it does. I'm just looking at your question. Yes, it totally applies to religious objects, objects looted from colonial contexts. I'm not quite sure about contemporary artworks in traditional media. I'm not quite getting the connection to that one. But I'm going to stop. I don't have a clear answer, so I'm not going to humiliate myself by continuing to try.
Here's something is thinking from Joy thinking of a quote by Pierre Nora: professional archivists have learned the essence of their trade in the art of controlled destruction. Do conserving institutions through their care, guide the work's inevitable obsolescence. This is a beautiful one.
Well, we hope not, right? But
guide the work's inevitable obsolescence. I mean, it's interesting to think about obsolescence in relation to performance, but I have never done this, but obviously, you know, the obsolescence question comes in relation to multimedia installations and all sorts of things that perform in different way, you know.
You know, and like embedded in that question is an idea that as soon as something enters a museum collection, it dies, right? There's the kind of the long tradition of writing over 200 years now of, you know, of the museum as mausoleum, and as soon as it enters, it loses its life, and so on. You know, which is true sometimes and not true at others. But I think, you know, what performance and to a degree installation art challenge us to do is to think about new models of acquisition, conservation, and lending that don't necessarily mean that something expires. And okay, so here's an example from the Van Abbe Museum that Charles Ash told me about, that they've bought a performance by the Israeli group Public Movement called Positions from 2010. But interestingly, it's listed in the collection as a concept, not as a performance. Mm-hmm. And the agreement is that they will play it, it's like a game, that they will play it every year. And so, and because of this, the museum was, because of the pandemic, the museum was shut last year. And so, you know, they ended up, you know, a couple of the staff having to play it at home, I think, or in order to keep it active. But it's a performance that operates like a game, which is it's basically just a piece of string which divides the room in two, and there's a set of questions, and the questions are read out, and the audience has to occupy one side of the piece of string or another. And the questions are, you know, things like Beyonce or Lady Gaga, but then they also get more charged, like Israel or Palestine. Gay or straight? Are you making more than $100,000? Are you making less than $100,000? That kind of thing. And so the museum, yeah, so the museum has this, you know, agreement to perform it once a year using a core of the original questions, but can add more questions to it to keep it relevant, to update it, to make sure that it's still in the present, that it still touches issues that are, you know, on people's minds every year. And so I like this example because I think it's the real kind of antithesis of, it's attempting to be the antithesis of obsolescence, right? It's, you know, trying to make a work not go out. Of course, works are both of their time and not of their time, and that component that is timely always runs the risk of appearing dated. But I think you just have to embrace that. But that's different to I think the kind of, you know, inevitable obsolescence that Joey is asking in that question. But I want to push back on the idea of museums as instant inevitable obsolescence.
I would also like to ask, sort of maybe from the flip side of that question, you know, it's inevitable, I think, that we talk a lot about museums when we talk about art, when we talk about conservation. Museums, of course, are collecting performance today, but are museums the only place that a performance can live long-term? We were talking the other day amongst ourselves about the idea of guerrilla conservation and what that might look like.
Great. What did you come up with?
Well, one thing is, you know, you can look at the question from the other direction and say, well, what isn't conservation? If I go to a performance and I'm there and I see it, and then we have a conversation and I talk to you about it, isn't that also a form of conservation?
I'm thinking of Triple Candle. Is that what they're called? It's a collective here in Harlem or the Bronx, and they've been doing, you know, they do sort of bootleg reenactments of things, and they've done a lot of David Hammond's works. And I think it would count as guerrilla conservation.
That's a great example.
You know, I remember writing to Steve Paxton in 2011 when I was trying to assemble images for Artificial Hells, and I said to him, do you have a good photo of Satisfying Lover from 1968 that I could use? And he said, no, just stage it yourself and take a photo. And that wonderful generosity, but it was also possibly a kind of fuck you, go away. I couldn't quite tell the tone of it, but there's just sort of this not really, being very open with the materials was also very, in keeping with the spirit of that work, if you know it. How does that relate? Why did that come to my mind? I guess just, artists having, being, and maybe this is something for artists rather than for museums, seeing imitation as the sincerest form of flattery, or allowing the public to redo and remake as a form of conservation and life of the work, ongoing life, rather than keeping it restricted. Here's another guerrilla conservation. Well, no, I don't know. No, it's too tied up with a commodity. But Tania Bruguera was asked to go and do a project at the Pompidou Center, which didn't receive a whole lot of press, but I think it's a very intelligent piece, where she noticed outside the Pompidou Center on the kind of that large sloping forecourt that there's a lot of people selling bootleg DVDs, CDs. I mean, this was 10 years ago, so now of course we're in the world of MP3, so the whole discussion is moot. But she made bootleg copies of all the videos in the Pompidou's collection, and worked with one of these African immigrants to be selling them for €1 each on the forecourt of the Pompidou. So I could imagine that moving into the territory of it's not conservation, because we're dealing with video and things rather than performance, but there could be. I feel in my mind, I feel like it relates.
Shall we take another question from the audience? We have one from Simona van der Etter. How much context would need to be conserved for ephemeral art? And to what extent should the essence of the content of performance be included? If I understand that question correctly, it's basically getting at this question of the context of a performance and how much, and I guess also the content as well. How much do we need to know about the content of a performance in order to conserve it?
Yeah, these are all questions of degree. There's no ready answer for all of this. It's not a recipe. Totally, each work is unique and has a different relationship to its context, and it could be enormous for some pieces, and it could be absolutely minimal or non-existent for others. So I don't think there's any kind of easy answer to that. There's no recipe, and you've got to work out what the piece is really doing, what it's about. But that sounds a bit like, you're a doctor giving the patient a diagnosis, but it kind of is as well.
Medical analogies.
It's like, let's pursue the medical analogy. You need to know what previous illnesses and conditions this type of work has had, and what it's going to require in the future.
Well, wait, does that mean, are we diagnosing it, or are we calculating its insurance costs? Because if we're talking about previous conditions, it sounds like the concern about, well, what is it going to take in a way to keep this work around? Although it's too easy to get into the medical analogies with conservation. So.
Let's move on.
We have sorry, go ahead, Hannah.
Also, it's very easy, but it's interesting that there are relation, in fact, between conservation and curation in this respect. If you look at the etymology of curare, it has to do with healing, with healing someone or making feel better. And conservators obviously have all these analogies and use them very, very skillfully in their theories. That they are those who are mandated, with this concept of bringing the works back to life or healing the works, and we do have the tools and so on, for this. But it's interesting to think about this in relation to performance. What are the tools? We don't have scalpels anymore, right? How can we repair the patient? I think there are, the metaphors that are just fantastically rich and worthy. Pursuing. Jules, you wanted to take another question from there is someone commenting on the obsolescence, which is quite interesting. Perhaps we could leave it as a comment. Obsolescence as in a performance-based or a historical, political, or similar case, and that becomes not necessary. The historical context changes and the audience cannot relate to it. Could that be considered obsolescence? It's a nice way to think about obsolescence in this case.
Sure, we're back to that, you know, question of political timing again, right? And yeah, I'm sure, you know, things read completely differently. You know, the naked body is a completely different, you know, entity, I think, today, at the height of discussions around identity and trans bodies. Is very different to what nudity meant in a performance in the 60s, where it simply denoted, you know, liberation. These things are, yeah, of course, yeah. I think, yes, we can deal with obsolescence in terms of, you know, a changing repertoire of meanings that no longer signify as potently in another period, but which might also come back again in another moment and have some have renewed valence.
Jules, would you like to take one of the questions?
Sure. We have a question from Aga Viloja. For works with multiple ontologies, e.g. performance, archive, installation, should all ontologies be collected and conserved, that is transmitted, equally to maintain the work's authenticity? And we could even talk about spiral jetty, which you mentioned before, as an example for this.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think they need to be transmitted equally, then collected differently. You know, they can belong in totally different institutions that specialize in different types of conservation and transmission. And I think that's part of the work's richness, actually, if it occupies different institutional spaces. Oh, I don't know, authenticity. Why am I still a little hung up on authenticity? Why do I flinch a little? I don't know why. You know, because it's interesting, other words that have, you know, received such a hammering by post-structuralism, words like truth, have really come to signify with some urgency now in the face of, you know, widespread populist denials of science. Truth is something we can now speak about again, but authenticity is somehow, it's still, a lot of damage was done to authenticity by post-structuralism, and I'm not quite sure where I'm at with it now.
Well, to be fair, Aga put it in scare quotes.
Yeah. So yeah, if we don't resort to scare quotes, what word would we use? Or, you know, I discourage scare quotes in my students' writing, because you're signaling a problem with a word without telling us what that problem is. But you're not finding an alternative. And so I'm curious to know what alternatives we might have.
I would turn that question to our conservators. Fidelity.
Maybe that's a little too, you know, badiou on, you know, fidelity to the event. I don't know.
Yeah, but fidelity to what, right? To whose version, or
to the work as its own agent.
It's interesting because you know, there are so many articles and writings in conservation on this aspect of authenticity, conferences and symposia, and it's really interesting. Sometimes we did this test with my students when you know, what would happen if the world's authenticity would be struck through and basically or left out, you know, what would happen if it is just not there? And basically you do get at the work, you just describe the work, not the authentic work, but the work. And then when I think, you know, strives to approximate the nature of the work or whatever that is, not to say the authenticity of the work, in a very different way, you know, without this kind of word which serves which strives to help us, but it complicates things. You know, we often use these distinctions by Nelson Goodman between allographic and autographic art. You know, the autographic being coming from the artist, kind of designated by signature, this original objects where the history of production is so important, and the allographic are those which are perhaps, you know, iterative. which have many instantiations like musical performance and so on. And you know, and authenticity also in other discourses or in analytical philosophy has been named by different names, such as expressive authenticity, you know, for performance or dance, musical performance or dance, and others. But still, there is, you know, we get a taste of it, but we don't really understand actually what that authenticity is, and sometimes left out. I really find it interesting. It's more helpful.
I think you're right that it's a word that makes things more complicated. It's a rhetorical device because it produces an insistence on something, and I've always found this when I read, you know, an authentic experience. Well, no, it's an experience, you know, and there's always degrees of inauthenticity and fakery and projection and fantasy in any experience. So the idea that something's authentic experience, just, you know, it's just take the word out, describe the experience, much as you're saying, just describe the word.
There is one question. We have still a few minutes left, Claire. So let us just take this question or the question from Kazi Albert. Are there concerns about the sustainability, cultural, environmental, financial, of this proposed approach for conserving complex variable works, performance, installation, time-based works, in a time where many cultural organizations are experiencing reduced resourcing? How does a modality of preservation that is very resource heavy in requirements fit? Is there a concern that this could impact the frequency of collection and future accessibility?
You know, what comes to my mind is that it seems that the question is coming from an assumption that you know, kind of the resources are all somehow digital, right? They're electronic and in some way. There's like the huge amount of gathering of images and statements and archival works and photographs, and that's even though I praised that Malba project online, it was essentially a lot of digital stuff being presented. But I think what maybe I'm fantasizing is a mode of live conservation that could be that actually will create it will create jobs for people in museums. It will create in-person experiences because it's more akin to teaching. You know, it's a mode of transmission that is embodied. And so let's see, you know, so reduced resourcing, but yes, a kind of a very interesting way, you know, there could be, I don't know. No, I'm losing my enthusiasm for speculating about the future because I need to just carefully work out my words here. Concerning complex variable works. Again, it's like there's too many stuff there. I can think about performance and I'm already fragmenting into different types of performance in my head. Then installation, there's the entire history of installation art, which ranges from the super minimal piece of wool across the gallery wall to an enormously, you know, material heavy, complicated 30-room sequence of rooms by Mike Nelson. You know, there's video, film, there's 16mm. I can't deal with all of those examples and produce a coherent answer. But in general, I would say I would like institutions to stop archiving everything so much, and that includes recording things and recording talks and yeah, and endless interviews and endless artist talks and endless events and you know, the more and more production of stuff. And I think if the pandemic's taught us anything, it's absolutely fine to dial back on that. And that, you know, the frenzy for archiving is a symptom of feeling that we don't have a grasp on time. And so maybe the kind of the response is actually just to you know, archive far less and experience slowness and being in the present with each other much more. If that doesn't sound too hippie.
It's wonderful, you know, being with each other in the real time as a sort of, you know, capturing the moment in the moment. It's a beautiful, actually, conclusion for our, I think, for our panel. which we will have to now end because it's 18:13 here in Bern and Zurich. And I would love to thank you so much, Claire, for making yourself available to this very challenging topic and for wonderful answers. And I think, you know, we'll keep on thinking about many of the notions you thrown in to this discourse of conservation as life fluid or enabling transmission. But we have to finish now this official part. And yes, I would love to thank you so much again. Let's just clap our hands. Thank you to Claire.
Thank you for pushing me to think.
Thank you to our wonderful audiences for the questions. There are much more questions here in the Q&A. We will convey them to Claire afterwards. We will also record this event. We are recording this event and have it online at a later point. So for those of you or friends who didn't make it or colleagues who didn't make it, please refer them to our website that has just been published on site. I also would love to thank my dear colleagues, the members of the SNF Performance, Conservation, Materiality, Knowledge for wonderful collaboration on this event. And yeah, thanks so much again all, and see you soon.